Hey, welcome to 49cc Scoot. My name's Brent, and today I'm going to be installing a Yoshimura R77 exhaust on my 2011 TMAX 500. The process should be somewhat similar for many exhausts and models of the TMAX, so maybe it'll help you out even if you don't have the exact same pipe or scoot. I'll start by removing this side panel so I can access the oxygen sensor plug hidden behind it. There are two bolts up front and one at the back, all requiring a 4mm hex. Once those are out, there are some pins in the back, so I'll just work my fingers under the edge and pull the panel straight out. Now I can free up the O2 sensor wiring and then push this little tab up to unplug the connector. Next, I moved up front and under the scoot to remove the 4 nuts holding the headers in place with a 12mm socket. Let me add a couple of notes here. First, I recently replaced my exhaust studs when I was doing other work. Most likely you'll find studs with much more rust than mine, so it may be wise to spray them with your favorite penetrating oil and let that soak in for a while before you try to remove them. Also, you may notice that there are more panels missing on my bike. Some of that is because I was doing other work as well, and some of that was to allow me to get better views for the camera. Anything that I needed to remove for the exhaust install will be shown. I supported the muffler while removing the hanger nut with a 14mm socket, and then the whole exhaust could be removed as well as the hanger hardware. There's a gasket between each header and the head that will either fall out when you move the exhaust or could be stuck in the head. Don't lose those. Find them and inspect each one. If the exhaust has been on the bike for long, I would plan on having replacements on hand. Mine were just replaced, so I checked them over and they looked good enough to reuse, so I set them aside. I used a 22mm wrench to remove the oxygen sensor from the stock pipe so I could reuse it in the new exhaust. Next, I wanted to remove the original exhaust hanger, but I had to take off some body panels to get to it, beginning with the small panel under the taillight. There are 2 plastic push rivets. Push the center sort of button in, and then the rivet can be removed. Once those were removed, I gently popped the panel out. For some reason, Yoshimura's instructions said to remove the taillight connector, which I'm doing here. That did not need to be done. It's actually the connections for the tag light right here that should be disconnected. They're 2 bullet-style connectors that just pull apart. The mudguard needed to come out next, so I raised the seat and removed the 4 nuts that hold the mudguard bracket up. Be careful not to misplace any of the spacers that sit under the nuts. There were 6 plastic rivets to remove on the underside. Then the mudguard was ready to come out, but I had to disconnect the tag light wires that I mentioned earlier. Once that was out of the way, I could see the stock exhaust bracket and I used a 14mm wrench to remove the nut. The whole bracket will turn until the tab sits right up against the frame, and then it will stay in place so the nut can come off easily. Yoshimura supplies their own bracket and a bolt for it, but the stock nut needs to be reused. I used medium strength thread locker on the bolt and then held the nut in place with a magnet to help me get it started. This gets torqued to 16.5 pound-feet or 22 Newton-meters. A rubber bushing is pushed into the mount, and then the aluminum spacer goes in as shown. At this point, the mount is ready to be used, so I put the mudguard back in place, beginning by reconnecting the tag light. Both connectors are the same, so just make sure you match them up by wire color. Then the mudguard can be pushed up into position, aligning the 4 studs on the bracket with the holes behind the seat bucket. After being sure that the bushings were in place, I started and hand tightened all of the nuts to hold the mudguard in position. These don't get tightened yet, so that adjustments can be made if needed when installing the plastic rivets. I aligned the holes and installed 3 rivets on each side. Then the mudguard brackets were torqued to Yamaha's spec of 7.2 pound-feet or 10 Newton-meters. After making sure that all of the wiring was secure and out of the way, the small rear panel pops into place and 2 plastic rivets secure it. Next up, I tried to push the muffler onto the header, but it wouldn't go. Mine was an unused open box item, so that may be where the problem came from for me, but I found a little bit of a flat spot at the end of the muffler, so I bent that area out just a little bit with pliers. I also had burrs or rough edges, but some quick work with a file took care of those, and then I could push the muffler all the way on without issue. It should take a little bit of effort, but it should not require lots of force. I peeled the protective covering off of the muffler clamp and then installed the rubber backing. The rubber strip should begin and end right about where the clamp bends sharply near each end. Then the clamp can be slid over the muffler. I installed the stock O2 sensor into the Yoshimura exhaust next, beginning by putting a few small dabs of anti-seize on the threads. Be careful not to apply anti-seize anywhere past the threads. The sensor is torqued to 32 pound-feet or 45 Newton-meters. You can use a special oxygen sensor socket or a crowfoot or flare nut style adapter. Just be sure to keep the torque wrench at a 90-degree angle to the adapter as shown so the torque will be accurate. I brought the exhaust assembly over to the TMAX and put the supplied bolt through both tabs of the clamp and the mount. Then I used the supplied washer and nut, but I only spun the nut on a few threads deep. I wanted it tight enough that the exhaust wouldn't fall off, but loose enough to allow for adjustment. I moved up front to start working on installing the headers onto the head, but before the headers can go on, you need to place gaskets between each tube of the header and the cylinder head. There should be a flat side and a rounded side. The best practice is to place the flat side toward the head. Sometimes you can get the gaskets to sit on the header well enough to push everything into the head, but it may be helpful to use a light coating of grease, copper RTV, or even a gasket glue to keep the gasket from falling off. In other cases, it may be easier to get the gasket to stick inside of the head, and again, you can use a product mentioned to help it stick long enough to get the headers on. Getting the headers started into the head was the worst part of this job for me. At first, they didn't seem to align. I ended up sliding the pipe out of the muffler, and then it was easier to get the headers started. I had no trouble sliding the muffler back on after the headers were done. I got one exhaust gasket on with the first tube, pushed the flange into place, and just started the nuts enough to hold the header. Then I pulled the other tube down enough to squeeze the gasket in there before pushing the flange up and starting the nuts on that side. Once all nuts were started, I hand tightened them before torquing to 14 pound-feet or 18 Newton-meters. The muffler springs were installed next, and the kit even included a spring puller tool. This does take quite a bit of force, so I like to start one end of the spring and then position myself so I'm pulling the spring toward me to get it onto the other side. I made sure the muffler and clamp were sitting in a natural position without tension, and then tightened the mount nut and bolt to 16.5 pound-feet or 22 Newton-meters. It's a good idea to look the exhaust over at this point to be sure it's not up against other parts of the scooter. If it is, you may need to loosen the hanger and clamp bolt or possibly even the header bolts and see if it can be adjusted before you move on. Once that was done, I reconnected the oxygen sensor wiring and secured it to the fairing. Then the side panel was reinstalled. There are a few tabs along the edges to align with other panels, and then it should push in with a small amount of pressure and stay in place. Then all 3 bolts can be installed to finish the job. The only thing left at this point was to fire it up and enjoy the new sound. If it's a little bit too loud for you, Yoshimura does provide an insert to quiet it down, which is often referred to as a dB or decibel killer. There's a rubber plug on the inner side of the exhaust that needs to be removed. Then the tube and the ring that it sits in can be placed in the pipe with a threaded hole facing directly toward the plug that was just removed. I'm not sure if this is standard practice or just an error with my muffler, but the hole that the screw was supposed to go through to hold the insert in place was not punched out in my muffler. I stuffed a rag in the muffler to prevent any debris from falling into the exhaust. You could also remove the muffler if you prefer, and actually what I'd suggest is, since I'm making this known, I would take a look at the exhaust before you put it all together and see if this is punched out or not. Then I used a punch, placed through the hole that I just unplugged, to try to knock the metal out where the hole should be. I was hoping that it was scored enough from the factory to just pop out, but it bent instead, so I used the pry bar to bend it back and forth until it broke off. That left me with two sharp tabs sticking out, so I used a rounded file to take those down pretty quickly before vacuuming to get most of the debris out and then removing the rag. Once that was finished, the insert would go in and I got the threads aligned with the access hole. Then the screw and washer needs to be installed. I dropped it into the muffler cap on the first try and had to fish it out with a magnet. The next time around, I put a little masking tape on my 4mm hex socket so the screw was very tight on there, and that made starting it much easier. I used medium strength thread locker and torqued the screw to 8 pound-feet or about 11 Newton-meters. Then the insert should be secure and the rubber plug can be reinstalled to finish the job. I would also recommend checking all of the exhaust fasteners after a few rides once the engine and the exhaust are cool. That about wraps it up. I hope this video was helpful and I'd appreciate a like if it was. If you want to hear stock and Yoshimura sounds with and without the insert, I'll be putting up another video at the same time as this one, so be sure to check that out. Hit the subscribe button and click the bell to receive notifications so you won't miss more TMAX and other scooter content. Thanks for watching.